We're going to get started with the Food Safety Educational Conference this morning, so welcome. My name is Taylor O'Bannon. I'm a state specialized agent in food safety for the University of Florida, and I will be your moderator for this morning's session. All right, so with that, we're going to transition over to Dr. Faith Kreitzer. On your agenda, you will see Dr. Laura Strawn. However, Dr. Kreitzer is going to be standing in due to weather issues. All right, so I'll turn it over to you to talk about coordinating your clean.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Really happy to be here with you today. Just by show of hands, how many people are managing like a packing house or pack shed? Yep. How many people, if you didn't raise your hand there, managing harvest activities, something along those lines? Yeah, a few of you. So this is really, coming off of talking about outbreaks, I think that this is very much in alignment with insurance policies, right? And I like for people, again, know that everything is a continuum, right? And you have to make kind of a differentiation for what makes sense for you in your own operation, and know that this is a roadmap, and it doesn't mean you have to get there tomorrow, right? It's just things to consider and things to think about. I did not pull this presentation together, but I think it does do a nice job of showing you high-level things to think about and to kind of contemplate, because ultimately, if you ever did win the unlucky lottery and you were implicated in potentially being involved in an outbreak, having good record keeping and documentation of clean breaks, if they really think there's something going on in the packing house or during harvest, can be one of your best forms of protection, right? And documenting that will pay off better versus sometimes we see, and you can see this sometimes across food outbreaks and recalls in general. Once the initial finding is and the recall occurs, sometimes you see that expand, right, to new lots, new production days, and many times it is because they cannot effectively document that, if something occurred on Monday, we had a program in place and it took care of it before we started packing again on Tuesday. And I get the place that you're in, packing out a raw commodity that has no kill steps in it. It's really tough, but I really want to see domestic produce stay as a viable option. So I appreciate the job that you're all doing, and happy to talk with you more if you have questions after this. So why are we interested in cleaning? I would say that, a lot of, and we even have a few products out there that claim to be an all-in-one cleaning and sanitizer option. What I'll say is, if you don't get soil removed from a surface, you're not going to get to the same level of inactivation when we apply that sanitizer. So ultimately, that is why we try and have these approaches. Now, this is actually a picture from one of my operations when I was in Washington State. This is where they're putting on a finishing wax, right? Not all things are equally able to be cleaned, right? There's a lot of brushes used. There's a lot of closed cell, open cell foam. There are a lot of nuanced surfaces, and then you compound it by putting on in this case, a wax, which is the fat, right? We know it's really hard to get fats off, right, without specific cleaners to do that. So in this case, really making sure that people are using those solvent-based cleaners that are going to strip that wax away so that we can, when we do apply our PA or our chlorine, it's going to come in. We also know that preventing cross-contamination is key, ultimately, to any sanitation approach we have. We know that by doing this, we're going to stop biofilms from forming. Biofilms, I think we have a slide coming up on it here in just a second, are basically what happens on your teeth basically when you get cavities. And you can usually find them, if anybody has some of those drink containers and there's a gasket in there. If you ever pull that gasket off and the gunk behind it, that's a biofilm forming. And I have a talk coming up at 2:30 this afternoon that shows that once that biofilm forms, it is really hard to remove those organisms once they're in that kind of nice little protective community. We know that we cannot sanitize as effectively that dirty surface, and we know that those sanitizers, there's no sanitizer out there on the market that is not impacted by organic matter. So by getting that level of clean is going to be really important. It also helps you comply with the produce safety rule as well as audit requirements that are also important to you. So ultimately, from the produce safety regulation perspective, and we have a little bit more language on here, it is really going to be important to try and clean those surfaces and sanitize them so that we can have a reduction in microorganisms. We're expecting, because we know these organisms are out there in the environment, hopefully at a very low level, they're going to be coming in occasionally into your operations, on your harvest containers, into your pack shed. And so by having a good sanitation program in place and applying a sanitizer, we're going to be able to reduce those numbers. As an added benefit, I've talked to a lot of people, and plant pathogens are also microorganisms. So guess what? When you're doing things from a food safety perspective, many times you do see a slight change in some of those issues that may have popped up if you were getting some cross-contamination from some of those latent pathogens that may pop up at the worst time, right? After you've harvested the crop, you shipped it out, and then it gets rejected ultimately. So again, you can have that added benefit that I say is kind of a nice bonus, right, when you're doing things a lot of times with food safety. People always told me that, this only costs me money and I never see it pay out. And I say, yeah, you have to kind of think of it as life insurance, right? Like you're trying to do these things to prevent stuff. Here's our slide on biofilms. Ultimately, biofilms are the hardest thing for us to try and take care of. And a lot of times, having a routine sanitation program so you're coming in frequently enough that you're just not giving them time to form. Otherwise, they definitely will over time. And what's happening here is you get the organisms landing. Turning things off. You're getting the organisms landing on your surface. This is when you want to apply your sanitizer, right? Because once you give them time, this polysaccharide goo that they're in basically is like a nice little shell for them, and the sanitizer interacts with that and never even gets to them. And so you're not going to even inactivate them, and then they grow to bigger and bigger populations, and they break off and contaminate your product. And a lot of times that is where we see continued contamination in past outbreaks. That has been theorized as one of the factors at play. We know that our surfaces that are hardest to clean and sanitize are going to be the most at risk for having these biofilms form. We know that we use a lot of surfaces that are absorptive, right? And that they are going to be easily, even if they're not, they're going to be easily scratched, right, as soon as we start using them at all. So making sure that we have a good sanitation program in place is going to try and reduce that load overall, even as these surfaces get aged and warm. Again, that time factor as far as extending the time between cleaning will allow for greater opportunities for biofilm formation, because essentially you're applying, everything's building up there. I've even had some facilities I've worked with in the past that have gone to quick water washdowns, right? Not even applying a sanitizer during the production day when they have breaks and things, lunch breaks, other breaks on the line, something that's really fast, just to try and remove some of that soil load and shown some really good efficacy there. It's always important to consider that you need to make this specific to you, right? I could tell, your friend, neighbor down the street's going to have different configurations of equipment, different ways they run that equipment, and different things that they see. So make sure you're keeping an eye on big picture, what's important to you in your pack house that you're operating. You want to identify all of your food contact surfaces, and then try and start creating an order of hierarchy for what's the hardest. And when you start out, you may not know that information right off the bat, right? It's not like you're born knowing this, but once you get in, and a lot of times just with visual observations, you're going to be able to pick out what's the hardest thing for me to clean, and start to then focus more intently on those as you start to build out your sanitation program. Decide what approach works best for you. There's not a one-size-fits-all that's going to work for everybody. And what's most important is that what you write down on a piece of paper actually happens in reality and it gets followed through. Don't be, the way I say, good fiction writers, right? Just because it sounds good. Have something that's actually what you're doing, because there's a lot of flexibility within the produce safety rule, especially when it comes to that timing. A lot of times we talk about cleaning and sanitizing, and we just look at it through the lens of having a wet cleaning and sanitation program, because that's normally what we go to. But in some commodities, like onions, we pack them out dry, right? So on those food contact surfaces, what we've learned from other industries is that it is not good to start introducing water to these dry operations. And you're like, well, how am I supposed to get the dirt off then, right? How am I supposed to actually do this job? It is similar, like not methods, but similar. First, you're going to go in and clean, and you're going to actually come in with something like a shop vac, right? Or something like sweeping, right? To just visibly remove the soil. Many people will then go in, sometimes depending upon the soil load, you may have wiping that occurs afterwards. The one thing I would say about wiping is that make sure that the surface you're wiping with, right, is either disposable or that it's getting laundered on something. I've been in some onion pack sheds, not in Georgia, but in other regions where, it was like, yeah, I wouldn't recommend cleaning that way. But ultimately, you're trying to remove that soil load, keeping it dry. And then sometimes people are looking at steam for these purposes. I'm a little cautious about that. Even with the superheated steam, a lot of times you still get condensation within our operations, especially in the southeast where the humidity is so high. Ultimately, that's going to be your best approach for having that dry cleaning. Then you're going to go in and apply a sanitizer after it that evaporates. So these are going to be alcohol-based sanitizers. Sometimes they have a quaternary ammonia compound with them, but that's our typical go-to when it comes to that. There are other fancier things out there like dry ice and other things that you can use for cleaning, but know that those are the general solutions that are applied on the dry side. For wet, I think it's a little bit easier, right? Because we've been washing dishes at least our entire lives, right? And even if you're not really involved in the sanitation program, we're trying to use water to remove that soil load. A detergent helps even more. And I can tell you will get a lot of microbial reduction just in that alone. And then you apply that sanitizer at the end that's in a water form and allow it to sit for the appropriate contact time. So this talk's all about clean breaks. And it's like, well, what really is a clean break when it comes down to it? We're really focusing on, sanitation clean breaks. Where can you document on paper? Like I said, if you had an event happen that you're unaware of, right? You don't know until weeks to months afterwards that this event happened. If it happened on Monday, can I show enough documentation to give the inspectors that are coming in there to investigate that event some good assurance that if there was contamination on the line, my sanitation program was implemented and it was effective, and I did not contaminate product that comes after that. That is ultimately what we're trying to do with these sanitation clean breaks. Sometimes we have people sanitizing after every production day or whatever frequency they've established, and they're looking to achieve that clean break, but they may be holding over things like water in a dump tank. And my word of caution would be to make sure then you're also documenting that water has appropriate sanitary measures, right, when you're holding it over. Because otherwise, and you can see how that would make sense, right? If you had a problem on Monday and then your water stays for Tuesday, those inspectors are going to have an issue with that. So it's not only surfaces, it's everything we may be holding over from one day to the next if we're not dumping that water. So ultimately what we're trying to get is a defined production break that involves a documented, verified, and validated, and we'll go into what those terms mean a bit more, cleaning and sanitation process for food contact services, and ultimately trying to get separation. I know you may have multiple production lots within a day, but again, just trying to get separation between those production days and whatever lots may be implicated. So, what is a lot? Ultimately, it's going to be a distinct portion of a crop, and everybody has their own way of defining lots. It's not uncommon to have multiple lots produced within a day, right, depending upon how you're defining them. But ultimately, we're trying to, for traceability purposes, trace this all the way back to what's happening in the field, what's going on. You may be holding that crop, maybe getting packed out immediately, following that through so that you, if asked, can recount all that information. Why are they so important? They define the quality of produce affected in a recall or outbreak. It really helps reduce your risk. Like I said, this is your insurance policy. I know, though, that this is time and money, right? And so, again, you have to take into account what I'm saying versus what makes sense for your operation and the level of risk that you're, acceptable of. Ultimately, lack of these clean breaks can expand food safety events and implicate more production days. Here's an example of where that occurred. This is our red onion outbreak from 2020. This is Salmonella Newport outbreak. It was epidemiologically linked to red onions in California. Some of the things the FDA looked at in their investigation report were food contact surfaces, which had not been inspected, maintained, cleaned, or sanitized as frequently as necessary to protect against the contamination of produce. Ultimately, what occurred was that 3 months worth of product that had been packed out, which extended to red, yellow, white, and sweet onions, were all then implicated in this. Why was it so expansive? Ultimately, straight from that report, it was due to concerns there may have been cross-contamination via food contact surfaces that were used to process red onions. So this is where having that documentation in place, showing the efficacy of your sanitation program is really key. And this is one of those products, right, where we're looking at a dry packed out product. This is a little scheme that helps with your cross-contamination. Let's see if we can get it to play. So you'd have your contaminated onion come through, and you're not going to know, right? These things are invisible. But what happens is that as that belt runs, or whatever the surface is, as that product comes in contact with it subsequently that's not contaminated, it picks it up. If there's anything we know about outbreak investigations, it takes a certain number of people getting sick. And by you reducing the amount of product that may be contaminated, you're going to be doing yourself a world of favor, right, when it comes to that. That's why so many people are starting to look at things they can do online, right, as far as spray beds and things along those lines that are, a wet, clean product. Where do we start when we're thinking about clean breaks? So start thinking about what needs to be clean, what type of soil is going to be there, right? Like I used with the waxing example, not everything's created equal or is equally easy to get off, including the surfaces, right? Brush beds are always going to be some of our hardest, foam's always going to be some of our hardest surfaces to try and get clean. Then you start thinking through, how frequently do I need to do these sanitation events? When you're in seasonal pack out, sometimes you're not packing every day, right? So how are you going to order that? And when's the timing going to be for these sanitation events? How should it be cleaned and sanitized? You may have different approaches for different surfaces depending upon how hard they are to get clean. And then ultimately, who's going to do it, right? It has to be on somebody's shoulders. And so frequently, we don't have a sanitation crew that's dedicated coming in. It's at the end of the day, right? When everybody's the most tired, coming in, trying to finish up and wrap things up. So making sure that they have the resources and that they know that somebody's going to be checking on them. And ultimately, determine a resource and infrastructure that are needed. It's ridiculous to tell people to do something and hit a mark when they don't have the time. A lot of times it's time, right? Or the actual tools and the materials they need to go about cleaning and sanitizing. So that shows that you're invested in it, and they're going to be far more likely to buy in and do a good job doing that for you. So this is what we're going to finish up walking through, and we'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail to give you some kind of time around that. So clean breaks define a production break that involves a documented, verified, and validated cleaning and sanitation process for food contact surfaces at best, right? That would be like our standard that we're trying to hit. Cleaning and sanitizing ultimately starts with validation, and we're going to want to clean and sanitize in a way that proves that it's actually going to work, right? I've talked to people in the past that maybe didn't know much about sanitizing. They're like, oh, I use vinegar wipe down. And it's like, yeah, something like peroxyacetic acid has a bit of vinegar in it, but that vinegar hasn't been shown by the EPA to be effective. So ultimately, what we're looking for is an EPA-registered sanitizer that you can use, right, that label, to then pull to say, okay, if I hit these things, and making sure that you're hitting the things like timing, right? Time of exposure is a lot of times what people maybe miss. And there's some things you can't get around. Sometimes you're going to have a porous surface, and it's hard to find sanitizer options for porous surfaces. So then knowing that and trying to maybe focus on those porous surfaces a little bit more, and some of the things we'll talk about next. Some other things that are typically in there are rinsing all the detergent, right? Or using a detergent, right? So you start with a visibly clean surface, or other things that come to be very important in those instructions. Next, we're going to look for monitoring. We're actually going to start checking to make sure that those cleaning and sanitizing events follows those proper parameters that you've established. And so ultimately, one of the biggest things are you checking to see what the concentration is of your sanitizer? That's a great place to start. There's been outbreaks that have occurred because people weren't even pulling the right compound out, and they're thinking it was a sanitizer, and guess what? It was not, because they're all locked in the same storage area, and they just pulled the wrong thing. So if you would have had records where you're asking them to monitor for that, right, they would have picked on that way easier, because guess what? There's no chlorine in this thing that I think that I'm using appropriately. That's the only way to really know you're hitting the right concentrations. Even though the label's going to tell you what part to mix with what part, it's a nice check and balance to have in there. So that's really important when it comes down, from my perspective, starting out on a good foot. You maybe don't have to do that every day once you get it established that your crew is trained and they know what to do, right? Maybe it can be something you do less frequently once that framework's been laid. We also want to see people monitoring cleaning. I would say this will pay off more than anything else you could do if you actually get eyes on your sanitation crew. Because guess what? Even though we can't see these microorganisms, we can see something that's not clean, right? And so this is an example of a dump tank where this tomato stem stay wedged in the bottom the entire production season, right? I can tell you, yeah, it's just an old, piece of the plant vegetation that got in there, but that is like a field day for these microorganisms, and that's carrying over day after day after day of production. So know that you have to get those things out. Start with the visible, right, before we start obsessing so much over the microscopic organisms. Let's start here as our beginning place if you're not already doing so. So you just walking after they've done cleaning, right? If it's timed right, you do this before they apply the sanitizer so they can just go back and re-clean and then apply the sanitizer. But if it comes at the end of sanitation when you're showing up in the morning, then having the resources there and knowing that you may not be able to start packing out the time you think you wanted to if you have to go back and re-clean certain areas. Normally it's not everything, but those areas that you've identified. Does that have to take place every single day of production? No. But it's there at some frequency that you're going in and checking that. You'll be able to identify pretty quickly what the weak points are. And everybody has weak points, right? Without scrutiny, we don't get better, is what I always like to tell people. So ultimately, before sanitizing, we want to make sure that they're using the right sanitizer, they're using the right concentration, they have the right PPE in place, right? And they have the right tools that they're using to sanitize. Then we go into verification, really checking to make sure that things are happening the way that you said that they were going to happen is what we're trying to do here. So ultimately, I would say that verification is another thing that pays off dividends. Again, none of this is required. Just to clean and sanitize is appropriate. Actually, when necessary and appropriate, sanitize all food contact surfaces is what's required by the produce safety rule, but the way you get there is through these steps, right? So with verification, we're going to look at procedures that show the effectiveness of our cleaning program and our sanitizer application. One of the ways to do this is through using these either really quick and rapid methods like ATP. I still have 7 minutes left, so I'm going to take it. If y'all want to get up and walk out, I understand. I understand lunch is calling, and I'm in between you and it. So you can use things like ATP to show the effectiveness, and that's something you get a rapid response back. You can also use, I would set the next level up is if you're trying to advance things, is actually start to look for microorganisms. We're not typically looking for pathogens here. We're typically looking for indicators like E. coli and coliforms, and if you want to have some more discussions around that, we can definitely do that. The one, though, that I would say doesn't cost you anything more than your time, and I get time is really valuable, are visual inspections. You doing visual inspections are going to be really important for you, and that does not cost you any additional resources as far as ATP meters or micro test results. And again, that is effective, right? Because you'll start to realize what's working well and what isn't working as well. Then we go into record keeping. For goodness sakes, if you do something, write it down, right? Because how else are you going to show to an auditor or inspector further down the road that you've actually done it? So I think that you all are very well trained on this since you're sitting in this room, right? But if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So let's make sure that we're doing that. We want to make sure that we have all these things in place. The Produce Safety Alliance has some record template documents. A lot of people have record template documents that you can take and augment that are Word documents. Know that for the Produce Safety Rule, we're keeping those records for 2 years. Know that don't forget your sign-off on these records. I would say that's the next thing that people forget when they're reviewing these records. You're just going, even if you're the one doing the sanitation, you're going to want to separately come back and review that record log to make sure everything's appropriately filled out. Then we're going to go into SSOPs and training. I would say if people aren't trained on how to do something, it's highly unlikely they're going to do a good job, right? That makes sense. If you have an SSOP in place, that just stands for Sanitation Standard Operating Procedures. This is your written document. Again, it is not required by the Produce Safety Rule, but man, is it going to save you a lot of time. Because guess what? People are going to leave. They're going to get sick. They're going to go on vacation. And this is a good starting place, once it's written down, to start training people. And I would say some of the best SSOPs are picture heavy, right? So that people actually see what you're talking about with very little words. We become more and more visual, right? So lean in on that. And then ultimately what you're trying to define is the who, what, when, where, and how of sanitation. And you're going to spell it all out in this document for them. And then we're going to look at ultimately this holistic system that we'll then have in place so that you can ultimately develop a master sanitation schedule. Because guess what? You're not going in and sanitizing and cleaning and sanitizing your coolers, right, on the same basis you are the pack line. But I would want to touch them, right, throughout that production season, at least at the beginning, and then maybe at other time points throughout, and then at least at the end, right? So things like that, like a master sanitation schedule, are going to help you identify some of those, what I say, offshoots that do cause people lots of problems. Things like forklifts, right? Things like that you will not necessarily think about on the regular that are going to sometimes rear their ugly heads and be your ultimate causative agent. Within that master sanitation schedule, you can go into routine, deep cleaning, right? End of season. I would also say beginning of season is really important from my perspective if you're a seasonal pack out. And note that like the most important thing to encompass in this master sanitation schedule are those things that are easy to slip off, that aren't getting cleaned and sanitized daily. Remember, the SSOPs are not required under the Produce Safety Rule. A lot of times people get confused, but it does help you, right? Stitch that program together so that it is more robust if scrutinized. So ultimately, food contact surfaces need to be able to be cleaned and sanitized. There needs to be procedures in place for doing that you come up with ahead of time and then evaluate on some basis to see how well they're working. Those sanitizers that you're using need to have an EPA label. You need to use it per the label and apply it in that manner. And know that just because you're using chlorine doesn't mean you're always going to have the same label for every chlorine compound. So look at those labels. The Produce Safety Alliance has a really great resource where you can go in and pull up, say, I want to use PAA. You can see all the different PAA products that are registered for cleaning food contact surfaces and compare their labels to see what's going to work best for you, and then start working with your distributors to see can you get that product where you're at. Ultimately, documentation is going to save you so much because you're doing all the work. Write it down. And I get it's a pain in the neck. I have to deal with it in my job too. I don't like it either. But it helps me, right, in showing that I am doing the things I'm supposed to be doing. And then when there is a change in equipment, cleaning and sanitation chemicals, production frequency, or an additional new product types, or you learn more, like as we start to learn more from these outbreak investigations, then be willing to change and pivot this plan over time. So no, just like anything else in food safety, we're always getting better with time, and we're hoping to grow those programs to encompass that. And ultimately, we're going to hope to limit the quantity of product in a recall if we ever are in that boat. And know that I know this is a lot of information. I'm happy to chat with you more. But we also have a fact sheet from the University of Florida that's getting updated now, but definitely check into it. And I would say there's a lot of resources here in this room that could help you with that. So thank you so much for your time today. And I'm sad that Laura wasn't able to give her presentation, but I appreciate being with you. If you want to learn more about cleaning and sanitation, come back at 2:30 because we'll talk more about that. So thank you.